Morning, church. We'll be reading 2 Samuel 7, 1 through 17. It's page 242 in your pew Bible. Now the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies. The king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go and do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But the same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving back about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over the people of Israel. I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. I will make you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from that time that I appoint judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you. Who shall come after your offspring? Who shall come after your body? And I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with a rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, when I put him away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David.
Thank you, John. So if my calculations are correct, it was exactly 811 days ago that we all went to the ballot box and voted for the President of the United States. And again, if my calculations are correct, in 652 days from now, we will return to vote for President of the United States. So this time in between seems like the perfect time to not talk about politics. Am I right about that? I think the reality is that for many of us, especially the last presidential election was so contentious that we all just needed a break from politics. I mean, we're right in the middle. This is the perfect time to not talk about politics. On the other hand, it might be the perfect time to talk about politics because I think we all need some distance, right? The reality is when you're right in the heat of an election, we tend to get very entrenched in our views. We become very polarized. We become very passionate about it because we're thinking so much about it. And I wonder if now, at a time when we're just kind of right in the middle, when we haven't really been thinking about it, we might be in a position to take a step back and to just kind of look at the whole issue of politics from a bigger perspective, in a larger light. So today we're going to talk about politics. Today we're continuing in our series called The Story. And the central theme of this whole series is that if you want to understand any passage in the Bible, you've got to set it within the context of the story, the overarching narrative that is the Bible. The Bible is a story. I say time and time again throughout this series, the Bible is not primarily an instruction manual for life. It is not primarily a book of timeless wisdom, though it contains all of the instructions and all of the wisdom that you could ever need. To get at those instructions and to get at that wisdom from any given passage, you must set that passage within this overarching narrative, this overarching story that is in the Bible. So let me just I'm going to kind of get us up to speed before we come to the passage that was just read. Let me get up to speed on where we are in the story so we can set this passage within the story, right? So the story begins with creation. God created everything, and he created it good, and he created humanity to reflect the beauty and glory of his creation, and indeed to reflect his goodness and his beauty to all of creation. We were created in his image to reflect his glory. But we decided, hey, we would rather not devote our lives to giving you glory. We would rather pursue our own ends. And we see in the story of Adam and Eve them losing trust in God and deciding to take matter in their own hands. And so humanity turns away from God. And we see then in the early chapters of Genesis what I call the spiraling decay of humanity. Things get worse and worse and worse. The farther we turn from God, the farther we begin to turn from one another. They go hand in hand. When we turn away from God, we begin to turn away from one another. And that's what we discover in those early chapters. But then in chapter 12, we get the third act. So we actually get Acts 1 and 2, and then the beginning of Act 3 all take place in the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis. And in Genesis chapter 12, we get the beginning of the third act, the act of redemption. God calls a people. God calls Abraham. And he calls him and says, through you and through your descendants, all nations will be blessed. I will use you and your people and your line to be the means through which renewal and redemption comes to this world. And so then the story progresses, and God blesses the people of Abraham. But then there comes a little bit of a hitch. We discover in the book of Exodus, we discover that they find themselves in captivity in Egypt. They find themselves enslaved in Egypt. And so now it's very difficult for them to be the means through which redemption can come. And so what does God do? God delivers them. God rescues the rescuers. They are the ones who are called to bring rescue to all of humanity, and yet they are in captivity, so God rescues the rescuers. That is the story of the Exodus. And so they come out of Egypt, and then God leads them into the land of Canaan. And we saw that last week in the passage we looked at in the book of Joshua, where they are brought into the land of Canaan. And then actually for the next 200 years is the period of the Judges. And the period of Judges is really just a period where there was no real centralized government. It was really just the different tribes of Israel. They all had kind of local control of the way in which they went about things. And from time to time, during difficult times, God would raise up a local judge who usually would just have some sort of authority in a particular region. And he would raise up that judge to help deal with whatever the issue was in that particular area. But then as we come to the passage we're looking at today, we find something very different. We find here the emergence of the monarchy. We find the emergence of this centralized government based in Jerusalem. And we find, of course, King David being anointed, being confirmed as the king of this great nation. And so that's really what this passage is all about. God promising to David this kingdom. Now, the question is, what are we to take from this passage for us today? We read a passage like this, and we ask ourselves, what does this have to do with me? How does this apply to my life? And I think if we take this passage and we read it just sort of on its own, we might come to a number of important conclusions. We could see in this that God is faithful, right? We see that. God is faithful. This is an example of God's faithfulness. God had promised Abraham that his descendants there would be the emergence of a great nation coming from his line. And so we see God giving this to David. So we see God being faithful to his promises. We could see from this that God is a God who protects us from our enemies. God raises up David. I mean, David is this incredible warrior. We, of course, know the story of David and Goliath. God raises up David as a man who can lead his nation and can protect them from their enemies. And so we could deduce from that, well, God will protect us from our enemies as well, right? He'll protect me from that mean coworker. He'll protect me from my in-laws. I don't know who your enemies are, but right, God is a God who protects us from our enemies. Okay, that's a good point we could potentially draw from this. We could draw from this that God will raise up leaders. God will raise up leaders within our own government. We could see that here in America, that just as he raised up leaders, raised up the judges, raised up David, if we put our hope in him, we can trust that God will raise up great leaders in our own country. And I think that all three of these points are things that certainly we could kind of draw potentially from this. But I think also as we draw these points out, we realize it's not quite complete. It's not quite complete, and maybe we're missing something. This is all good. And here's the point. When we set this passage within the context of the whole story, we find some other things that emerge. So let's do this for a moment. We're going to set this within the context of the story, and in particular, what happens when we set it in light of the climax of the story. And of course, what is the climax of the story? The climax of the story is the coming of Jesus. We discover that the entire Old Testament is pointing to, building towards the coming of Jesus. And so to understand any passage and how it applies to us now, we must set it in light of the coming of Christ. And I think if we do that, we can kind of revisit these three themes we've already looked at. The theme that God is faithful. Yes, God is faithful, and we see that in light of the climax. In fact, we see that his faithfulness is taken to a degree that perhaps we never could have anticipated, and that is that God is so faithful to us, he will remain faithful even if it requires the giving of his own son. You see, many of us will remain faithful to a point, but there comes a point where we're like, okay, I'm done. You've crossed the line. But what we discover in the light of the climax of the story is that there's no line. God is willing to give of his only son. He's saying, I will give that which is the most valuable to me because I love you and I am committed to you. So we see the faithfulness of God is taken to a whole another level. We see in light of the climax that yes, God is a God who protects us from our enemies. But in light of the climax, in light of the coming of Jesus, we find that the definition of who our enemies changes. God redefines who our enemies, and we discover that our enemies, well, it's not your coworker. It's not your in-laws. It's not whatever nation we might find ourselves in opposition with. We find in light of the coming of Christ that our enemies are spiritual enemies. There is a spiritual darkness that is the true enemy we are facing. And this emerges in the book of Ephesians. The Apostle Paul highlights what really emerges in the ministry of Jesus. And this is what the Apostle Paul says. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So our enemies are not people per se. They're not people groups. They're not political parties. Our enemies aren't the Democrats. Our enemies aren't the Republicans. No, our enemies are the power of darkness that are at work in both the Republicans and the Democrats and in your own life. In your own heart. That's our true enemy. And in light of the climax, we see that God will ultimately protect us from those enemies. And then thirdly, how does this apply then to our own political context? Can we see in this maybe a theme that God raises up leaders, and we can anticipate that God will raise up leaders in our country? Well, certainly that's something we can pray and hope for, but I think in light of the climax, we see something so much bigger. And here's what we see. no matter who is in office, Jesus is our true king. This is the big picture within which we must set any notion of politics and our understanding of that. That no matter who is in office, Jesus is our true king. So we see in the passage that was read today that God promises to David a dynasty, to give him a house. Let me read this passage here, the latter portion of what was read. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. And that's a way of talking about a political dynasty. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom. Here immediately he's talking about Solomon, who would build the temple. Then he goes on, I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men and floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it from Saul when I removed whom I removed before you. Then your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So here we see God making this promise to David that he and his line will have a kingdom that exists forever. Now, the people of Israel, they remembered this promise that God made to David. And they remembered it in subsequent centuries. In particular, they remembered it when the kingdom came to an end, or at least it seemed to. When the Assyrians came and the Babylonians came and they destroyed Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple and they put an end to this kingdom, they held on to this promise that this kingdom would last forever. And of course, what we discover is that this promise that is made is then fulfilled in who? In the coming of Jesus. In the book of Luke, we find this pointed towards. Luke chapter 1, verse 32, speaking of Jesus, he will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there will be no end. And we see that this is then confirmed at Jesus' baptism. And the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form, like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased. You are the Son to whom I have given this kingdom. You know, and you might think of it this way, since we're talking about it in terms of contemporary politics. You might say that Jesus' baptism, roughly speaking, is kind of like election day. Like, okay, he's elected, he's in power, he's in office, and then, you know, like when somebody's elected, there's that weird transitional period before Inauguration Day in January, that weird transitional period where they're kind of in power, but they're not really in power. And you might say that it's kind of like that between Jesus' baptism and his resurrection. I remember I had a friend who worked for the Bush administration, and he told me, George W., and he told me that after George W. Bush was elected, the Clinton administration, right before he came into office, as a joke, the Clintonian staff, White House staff, they removed all of the W's from the keyboards in the White House, so that when the Bushies came in, they came in to use the keyboards, and there was no W on any of the keyboards. A little bit of a joke between them. So, but the point is, there's this weird, awkward transition, right, between the election day and then the inauguration. And in some respects, that's kind of what the ministry of Jesus looks like. It's like, who is this guy? He's the king, but there's signs that he's the king. And then with the resurrection of Jesus, now the world sees, okay, this guy is king. Jesus is the one to whom all of this is promised. And again, the Apostle Paul highlights this well. In the book of Philippians, he says this, speaking of Jesus, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. In the resurrection of Jesus, we see that no matter who is in office, Jesus is our true King. Jesus is Lord. Here's one thing we need to see about this. Jesus is not just Lord of your heart. I mean, he is. You surrender to him, he's Lord of your heart. But it's more than that. Jesus is Lord over all things. You know, if all Jesus wanted to do was kind of be Lord of your heart, the Romans never would have crucified him. There are political overtones to him being the Messiah. It's not just that he's Lord. He is Lord of your heart, but it's much bigger than that. He is Lord over all things. You see, put it a different way, Jesus as Lord, he is at work in all things, whether you realize this or not. God is at work in industry. God is at work in education. God is at work in politics. God is at work in all things. He is present and doing his work. He is sovereign over all things. You know, this season here after Christmas is a season in the life of the church in which we are encouraged to reflect on the coming of the power of the kingdom of God in Jesus, the manifestation of Jesus, that God is here. We sang that song, God is here. And this is something that we can often lose sight of. God is here. God is present. God is at work in all things. Okay, now what does this mean for us then as citizens, U.S. citizens who vote? How does this apply then to when we go to the ballot box? And I would just say this. This is the big picture perspective I would encourage us all to have. We should care more, but worry less. We should care more, but we should worry less. First of all, we should care more. And we should care more because Jesus cared. Like Jesus cared about people. Jesus cared holistically about people. He cared about them spiritually. He cared about them physically. He cared about them socially. Jesus cared about people, and so we should care about people as well. And so because of this, we should care, because the reality is that the decisions that our leaders make, they affect people. They do. They affect people. And so because of that, we should care deeply about who is in position. In other words, there's no place for political apathy. Christians should not be politically apathetic because Jesus cared about us holistically, and therefore we should care about people holistically, and because politics affects that, we should care deeply. So there's no place for political apathy. Secondly, what we see in this is that when we vote, we shouldn't just vote for what's best for me. Right? I shouldn't just vote what's good for me. If we're really followers of Jesus, Jesus cared a whole lot more about other people. It wasn't about him. So when we vote, I think a lot of people think, well, everybody should just vote for what they want, and then it'll kind of work itself out, right? Okay, I understand that perspective, but that's not a very Christian perspective. As Christians, we should vote not just what's best for me, but what is best for others as well. Now, here's the problem. Here's where, well, there's lots of problems, but here's where one of the problems lies. Best is complicated. Best is complicated. What is best for your neighbor, for those around you, is complicated. And look, this is true not just in politics. This is true in life. What is the best way to parent your children? You can ask 4 different Christian families and get 4 very different answers. I mean, I know Christian parents that all of them, they love Jesus. I mean, they love Jesus the same, But boy, they just parented very differently, right? And they were, they were convinced that their way was the best way to do it. And you realize, well, best is complicated. When you're parenting, like there are these questions like how much do I help my kids out, and how much do I let them figure it out on their own? And good meaning Christian parents, they go different ways, different directions on that. How long should I let my children stay at my house? Should I let them stay with me until they're 65? Or should I kick them out when they're 18? And they're good Christians. They have different perspectives on what is the best way to approach this. Should I teach my kids to take risks? Or are you more of like the, one in the hand is better than two in the bush kind of parenting? Right? I mean, what is best? And the reality is that best is complicated. And this is true in politics as well. Oftentimes, the reality is you can have two people who actually share the same values, and they actually share the same positions on all the different issues. They just weigh the issues differently. Well, this one's more important than this one. Even though they don't actually conflict in what they think about those issues, they just weigh them differently, right? So you see, best is complicated. This was drawn out for me, a particular story just in my own family. So my grandmother and her father, my daddy Oz, they ended up, towards the end of their lives, as they got older, they ended up living together. And they lived together for about 30 years, my grandma and my great-grandpa, and both wonderful Christians. My great-grandfather, just the sweetest man. I remember one time somebody slammed, his hand got caught in a door, like the door got shut, a car door got shut, and he just stood there and he goes, excuse me, would it be possible for someone to help me out? I didn't want to bother anybody, even though his hand was stuck in the door, right? Just a wonderful Christian man. And then my grandmother, also a wonderful Christian woman. She was a church organist for, like 700 years, something like that. Just a wonderful, wonderful woman. Both loved Jesus. And here's what was funny. For 30 years, when the election would come about, whatever, they would get in the car and they would go to vote. And every time they went, they would cancel each other's vote out. Every time. And they'd laugh. They knew. They're driving. They're like, we could just stay home because we're literally just going to, but they would go and they would cancel each other's out. Why? Because best is complicated. Best is complicated. Nonetheless, we should care. This is the point. We should care about, even though best is complicated, we should do our best, right, to contribute to what we think is best in light of what the Lord is revealing to us, so on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we should care more, okay? Actually, maybe put it a different way. As Christians, we might disagree about what is best, but we can't disagree about the importance of caring for people. We might disagree on how is best to care for people, but the one thing we can't disagree on is that caring for people is what matters, you see? So we should care more. We should care more, but we should worry less. Care more, worry less. I mean, isn't it just true that at the last election, there was just so much anxiety on both sides of the aisle, just massive anxiety and worry about what would happen if so-and-so was elected. And as Christians, we can care more, but we should worry less. So you might say, what I'm trying to do here is, I realize that the last election, I remember talking about politics, but it was too late. Everybody was already so worried that I couldn't do anything to prevent that. So you might call this preventative pastoring. Like preventative medicine, you try to catch it early before it really flares up. So I'm trying to catch the anxiety before it flares up. Care more, worry less. Because here's what we need to realize. God isn't worried. God has absolutely no anxiety about the next election. God isn't worried. We shouldn't be worried. Now, once again, why is it that God isn't worried? Here's why God isn't worried. All people in authority are placed there by God. He's not worried. He's the one that puts them there. we find in the Scriptures, we find this particularly in the New Testament, this idea that Christians should submit to the governing authorities. We should submit to the governing authorities. And we find this here in Romans. We find this a couple places, but probably the most known passage, Romans chapter 13, on this particular issue. Paul says this, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God." And so it goes on to say we should submit to the authority because it's appointed by God. Now, it's not absolute. There are times when we stand against authority. Clearly, that was the case for the early Christians. They wouldn't have been persecuted if they had always gone along with what the authority said. But the general rule is we should submit to the authorities precisely because God is the one who appoints this. And what we really need to see, especially when we look at a passage like Romans 13:1, is just how unbelievably ironic it is that Paul would say this in his particular time period. So the governing authorities in his time, it was the Roman Empire. And guess what the Roman Empire did? They killed Jesus. Paul is telling them to submit to the very governing authorities that killed Jesus. I don't know that you can get a whole lot worse than killing the Son of God. And yet, he is telling, and this is at a time period where the Christians, this is building into persecution. We know that many Christians in this time period were martyred and killed by this government, and yet he's saying to submit. So you see the irony here that he recognizes that even when it seems so oppressive, there's still this precedent that we ought to submit to the authority because God is the one who, in the mystery of his providence, is sovereign over who is in power. Sometimes I'll hear people say this after their candidate is elected, and they'll say, I just knew that God chose this person for this particular time. And I'm like, the person you thought was a crackpot, God also chose that person too. So don't get too excited about this, because actually in the mystery of God's providence, he chose every single one of them. Here's the big picture we need to see. The story will advance no matter who is in power. Right? The title of this series is The Story. The story of the Bible, the story of creation. And it does not matter who is in power. The story ultimately will advance. And again, why is this? Because God is in control even when things seem completely out of control. I remember a number of years ago, my son Caleb, he was learning to ride a bike, and we got him one of those Strider bikes, the bikes that have no training wheels, which I'm telling you, that is the way. Training wheels, you don't even need those. You just use the Strider bike. They learn how to get their balance, and then you just get them right on a bike. Worked great for him anyway. So we get him this Strider bike, and he loves it. He takes it everywhere. I remember one time, he kind of became one with his Strider bike. I remember we were at a picnic outside, and he'd been riding his Strider bike. We're like, Caleb, come to lunch. So he rides over to the picnic table and just eats his lunch sitting on his Strider bike, and then goes off and rides again. Anyway, as he was learning to ride this thing, I went on a little walk with him on this trail, and we're going on this trail, and we come to this little hill. And I kind of had to help him get up the hill. And I'm thinking to myself, when we come back, this hill could be a little bit dangerous. He could get a little more speed than he's ready for. So we come back, and but I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I'm just gonna kind of let this get a little out of control. And I had confidence that I would be able to save the day. And I'm telling this story because this is one of those rare occasions where I did save the day. It was awesome. So I'm walking next to him, and we start coming down this hill, and he starts speeding up, and I'm just running alongside, but I don't stop him. Just going along, just run alongside. He starts picking up speed, and then all of a sudden, he flips, and I reached down and just grabbed him in the bike right out of the air. It was unbelievable. I love it. Okay, on a much grander scale, God is completely in control, even when things seem totally out of control. Listen, no matter who gets elected in the next election, some of us are going to think things are out of control. They're not. God is in control. Because no matter who is in office, Jesus is our King. This is what emerges from this passage when we read it in light of the story. We now come to our time of communion.